everybody. Welcome to our webinar series, which we call Easier Said Than Done. My name is Matt Bland. I work for a charity called the Society of Evidence-Based Policing, and we're all about trying to make evidence more accessible, get it out there so that people in the policing community can put it to good use. And today we're going to be talking about social media and violence involving children. If you, like me, if you work in this space or you have children, you'll be aware of how life has changed so much in the last few years around use of social media. And actually trying to navigate some of that space as a parent can be really difficult, let alone as a practitioner working in this space. So we're really keen to have a conversation about what the research evidence says around how we deal with social media and children and violence, but also, as we do in this series of webinars, try to get a take on what it's like in practice to do things in practice. So I'm really pleased to be joined by a panel that spans academia and violence prevention from the policing side today. And we'll introduce you to everybody in a moment. Just to say the idea is for this to be semi-formal, so it's going to be very conversational in style, questions between me and the panel in the first half. But we do encourage you to interact and put your questions to the people who are the experts in this space. So please go ahead and use the Q&A function. So it's not the normal, if you're used to Teams, it's not the normal chat function. There's a button for Q&A, and that's where we will post, or we'll take the posts for the questions and we will review those. And then in the second half of the session, my colleague Ava, who will introduce herself in just a second, will take over the chair and put those questions to the panel. So really encourage you to get on board there. Ava, if you want to tell everybody who you are, and then I'll turn to the panel to introduce themselves, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Ava. I'm an intern at SEBP. As Matt said, I'll be coming on at the end to help out with the Q&A and asking our panelists questions that you guys pop in the chat. So please make sure that you're adding questions in throughout.
Great, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, let's meet the panel then. Donna, if I could ask you to tell us who you are, where you're from, what you do.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me properly now. Excellent. So my name is Donna Caesar. I'm currently, well, as of the last couple of weeks, I'm the current ADCI, Acting Detective Inspector for Comms, Engagement and Intelligence within the Met. But previous to that, I was working with Paul Connolly in and around social media, serious youth gang violence. And my particular role was looking at engagement, not only with social media companies, but more importantly for myself, working with young people to really bring some of that learning that we gain from a practitioner point of view back into the space where those most impacted by serious youth gang violence, that I could have those conversations with them. So in a nutshell, that's me.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Donnie. Very welcome, and congratulations on the acting DCI role. And then Paul, that seems like a good segue to you, as you mentioned there.
Thanks, thanks Matt. Thanks for having me today here, folks. Paul Connolly, I'm a DI. I'm currently seconded to the MPCC to lead the National Knife Crime Centre, which our objective is to try and dismantle and disrupt and understand the online supply of weapons better than we currently do. I've been working in the online space in terms of law enforcement for the last 5 or 6 years now. I've had a number of roles, but primarily most of my 17-year career within policing has been within the Met and dealing with serious youth violence, mainly at ground level, so dealing with urban street gangs, etc. And around 2020, I suppose I'll wake up call a little bit to the impact of social media on those particular types, but I imagine we'll cover that in the conversation. Thank you very much.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Last but definitely not least, Dr. Amrit Purba, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Matt, for the invitation today. I guess by way of a background, so my background's in clinical practice, public health policy and causal epidemiology. I'm an assistant professor at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a Wellcome Fellow. But I lead the Digital Determinants of Health Hub, and our remit is essentially understanding social media as a commercially structured exposure system with the ability to shape behaviour and norms at scale rather than just simply focusing on, for example, time spent on social media. I do a fair bit of policy work, so I sit on the UK Anti-Knife Crime Coalition, and I was previous Deputy Director for what was the Department for Science, Innovation and Technologies Commission on Social Media and Youth Health, with a real focus on online violence and the way the digital environment contributes to violence offline.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm really excited to learn more about this over the course of this session. I've sort of been weighing whether to start on the academic side, on the evidence side, or on the operational side. I think I'm going to just ask Paul, Donna, just to describe what the landscape looks like in terms of dealing with this in policing at the minute. What forums are there? What sort of main frameworks where NPCC and the Met are interacting with social media companies, and how does that look day to day?
Paul, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to start. So there's a few bits to unpack in your question there, Matt. So from a law enforcement perspective, talking initially from my quite a number of years within Metropolitan Police, we have a number of officers and staff dedicated to looking at the online space and what that looks like. The reality is, and this is really important, that we don't police the internet. The internet is a very big space, and it's just, the capability and the capacity within policing simply isn't there. There's 120,000 police officers ish in the UK, and we need them all with change to police the internet and actually what to do around that. I think the learning for us is understanding where our role, what our role is as law enforcement in the first instance, and whose responsibility. I don't think we've quite worked out what that is yet. But what we do have is some sort of manner or a platform, if you like, to communicate with those tech companies. Now, the issue is we can't compel a tech company to talk to us. When I say tech company, I'm talking specific around social media platforms that you'll all be aware of, your TikTok, your Snapchats, your Metas, Facebooks, Instagrams, etc. So we can't force them to come and talk to police. We have very little control over how they go about, I suppose, policing their own platform and the way in which they operate. These companies are all based outside of the UK. So therefore, they're not governed by the same rules and regulations that a UK business might be governed by. And even then, it's not a case of, Paul, could you just ring up, insert person, head of social media company here and ask them to do something. At law enforcement level, and I do a lot of talks to members of the public, I think there's an expectation that we can do that. We can simply go, could you please go and remove this, I don't know, post of, it could be really, really video nasty, or it could be something that's, relatively low level or anything in between. And the reality is we have no power to simply say to them, you must remove this. And I suppose part of me, that's necessarily a bad thing. Do we want to live in a state where the police can control that entire space? That's probably not what we're about. And there are other countries that perhaps that is the law, or that is the thing. But what our role is, and Donna's far better at this bit than me, is in building those relationships with those social media companies and arguably raising some awareness with them around the issues. Because some of the stats that are put out there, and please don't quote me on this one, but most platforms will say they're 99 or 98% safe and their content is perfectly safe. But 1% of a lot is a lot. So there's 1% of stuff that isn't very pleasant. There's still quite a lot of stuff out there. But critically, that most of you on this call are not going to be seeing the real sort of graphic, vulnerable exploitation, violence, weapon sales stuff that perhaps some younger people are seeing, because that's their natural level of interest when they're navigating those platforms. So I guess for us, it's identifying the mass risks. That could be one of those platforms I mentioned. We do have contacts in all those social media companies. They all have UK trust and safety teams. That's a term that's pretty well banded about. So we have a trust and safety team. We'll have a UK lead or a European lead, and we are in relatively regular conversation with those. I've been lucky enough to sit at a couple of different roundtables with them, and we've shown them some of the stuff that members of the public, or perhaps Donna's and my previous teams, have found. And generally speaking, where it just doesn't sit right, they'll look to remove the stuff. But what we don't have is a system in place where they're proactively reporting these issues into law enforcement, with the exception of the online abuse space, which has got the NECMEC system, which is based in the States, which is where there's child abuse on the platform, and they're compelled by US law to engage with law enforcement around that piece. But of course, there's a whole other raft of issues with social media that aren't just child sex abuse piece. So there's some work we've got to do around that. But I'll pass it to Donna to fill in some of the gaps.
Oh, thanks, Paul. That was eloquently put, and I agree. I think some of our biggest concerns have been in and around who owns that responsibility, and I'm completely in agreement with Paul. Having policing in that space, it has been and remains a very kind of contentious piece of work. So some of the work that I do is in and around that scrutiny piece. How do we reassure society? How do we reassure our communities that we are not particularly looking at certain groups within society? Some of the work that I've looked at in particular is around the use of lyrics, drill music, that perception that we as police, we are policing a considered to be a black music content. So I spend a lot of time speaking with social media companies, with our communities, just to give that reassurance about the why we do what we do and the way in which we do it. But as Paul was quite rightly said, when it comes to social media companies, we do not remove anything from social media site content. We simply refer, and the process of referral is quite a stringent, tight one. And I think Paul would agree with me in that respect, that we have some amazing people that work within this space, and anything that we refer into our social media companies, the intelligence base will be absolutely solid before we make those referrals. But ultimately, the responsibility sits with the social media companies to make that removal decision. But as stated, I spend a lot of time with our communities, with our stakeholders, with our key partners, just to have those conversations about some of the work that they can do to support young people. That is primarily my space in and around how do we upskill young people to protect themselves more safely on social media, because, and I will caveat, there's an amazing amount of stuff that you can do on social media that really, really is important for young people. There's so much education, communication, contact with others, but it's really kind of reinforcing some of the dangers, some of the exposure that young people can face, and us also working with our operational teams that proactively that we can support what we are seeing in terms of that fast-paced violence that we do see on social media. So it's a massive piece of work that people like Paul, our teams undertake in this space. It's a very evolving space. Content, platforms, they change all the time. So it's about making sure that we're fully equipped to understand what is out there. But just for reassurance, it really is about holding ourselves to account, and we are open to the scrutiny that comes with this space. So hopefully, Matt, that gives you a little bit of content about what Paul and I are trying to do in achieving this space.
Yeah, it's quite, I mean, it sounds like a scarily tall order, to be honest. So we're going to have to sort of break this down and parcel it up a bit, I think. But Amrit, can I just come to you and I don't want to ask you the question, you know, what does the evidence say about social media and violence? Because that question itself is far too big. But thinking about your research and the young people's exposure to social media, are there some themes you want to pick out there just to contextualize where the evidence base is in this space at the moment?
I mean, no problem. I think I just want to quickly touch on some of the statements made by Donna and Paul, because I think one of the things that I want to highlight the limitations of academia. So I had the pleasure of seeing firsthand the work that Paul and Donna have done, and they have a level of knowledge that is just not available in the academic space. And by that, I mean their understanding of, for example, their terminology used in drill music. What does that actually mean? How does that get used? How does that then lead to risk? And I think it's more and more, the more time I spend understanding their work, I recognise the absence and the limitations in academia, and more importantly, the way in which there should be collaborative working to actually understand what's actually happening in this online space. So, for example, the police can identify emerging harms. They can identify these years before they even are published in the academic literature. We can then bring something different as researchers. We can evaluate the observations. We can understand what's happening, look at causality, and then generate evidence that can inform policy. So I think it is a huge issue that needs tackling, but one of the lessons I've learned is it cannot be handled or tackled in isolation and in silos. We need collaborative working across the board. And by that, I mean public health general practitioners, school nurses, police individuals, academics, etc. And if someone was to ask me, why are we in the position we're in just now? I'll be blunt and say that people haven't left their egos at the doors. No one's been willing to share resource. No one's been willing to share best practice because everyone wants to approach this on their own. And we failed as a result of that. So my ask now when I go into these meetings with policymakers is, can we leave our egos at the door, because we're dealing with children. We're dealing with kids, vulnerable kids that need help and support. Coming back to your initial question, sorry, Matt, I think the evidence right now, it has come a long way in the last 10 years. So if we look at recent evidence, we had a systematic review which essentially combines a whole load of studies across the board and looks at, well, what are the findings? And we synthesised evidence from around 1.4 million youth internationally. And we found consistent links between social media use and weapon carrying, violent behaviours, aggressive behaviours, etc. But the problem with that was that it was all correlational. So we didn't really know, is this causal? Does this cause this? And that can be quite tricky to do. And that's what we're trying to basically look at through the Digital Determinants of Health Hub. And the reason causality can be quite difficult in this space is normally we go to children and we say, how much time do you spend online? Or what did you see online? And we forget what we have for breakfast, let alone kids that are navigating several different platforms. So the measure we get is ultimately flawed, and that can then limit any findings we get. So what we're trying to do through the hub is a new form of data collection called data donation, where youth can actually, under UK GDPR, donate their data, their social media data, to research. And we can then have an understanding of what are they actually seeing online. And this is where the knowledge of the policing profession comes in. It's invaluable because they have an understanding of, how does this content appear online? What's the slang used to relate to a knife? What emojis are used by kids, etc. And we can then use that knowledge to have an understanding of what kids are actually seeing and then quantify it to some degree, which can then be used to inform publications, which then ultimately get used to inform policy. So I think that's what we're doing in this space right now. But I know we should consider movement forward, but I want to talk about one of the biggest lessons I've learned in this space is that we're chasing our tail now because we have continuously focused on mental health as an outcome when it's come to social media. A politically acceptable outcome, albeit, and we've completely ignored behaviours that affect vulnerable youth, such as violence, antisocial behaviour, drug use, etc. And this is a flaw for the government, if I'm being completely honest. Every consultation has continuously focused on mental health. And if we were actually able to broaden that picture to look at child criminal exploitation, all of these other behaviours, would we still be in the space we're at just now where we're questioning is social media good or bad? 100% no. So I do wonder about the need now for a public health approach to really come on board right now and push this area in the way that it should be, in terms of actually understanding what are population health impacts overall, not just specific to mental health.
So much to unpick there. Thank you. That's and really eloquently put about the difference between correlation and causality, which to be honest here feels immaterial to a certain extent, because this is such a fast-moving area. And I guess what I want to start with in just thinking about this line of public health approach, and just to explore this with the three of you, around what that might look like and how close to that we are now. Because obviously in violence reduction, the public health approach is something that's been talked about for years, and has sort of led to this sort of violence reduction unit setup that we have across the country today. I'm interested in the sort of gap between that infrastructure and where we might want to go around social media. Anne-Marie, your research talks about social media as an amplifier of existing problems, violence problems. What sort of prevalence are we thinking here in terms of, social media use is widespread? This is a question for all of it, from both of your perspectives. One, from the research side, and two, Donna, Paul, what you see in practice. What's the volume of the link here between social media and violence in real life? What are we seeing? Are we seeing dozens a day? Are we seeing hundreds, thousands? What is it as a proportion of children out there? What is the scale of the risk here that we're talking about?
Go on,
Paul. It's a hand grenade of a question, but I just want to start us off at this.
I mean, for 11:19 in the morning, you've gone big there, but I think. But I don't mind putting my head above the parapet. So the question is, what proportion of violence do we think of some social media connections? Is that kind of where you're getting at here? Is that?
Yeah, I guess the question is, how big is this problem? Like,
how big is the problem?
How big is the problem? And that can be. Amrit, you said, this is bigger than just mental health. We're talking about violence outcomes.
Yeah,
how big is this problem?
I'll be frank. I'm not an academic, because we debated this on Friday, didn't we, Matt? But I have been doing this a while. Even in the last 4 weeks, I've said to a very senior officer within the MPC, and I've been talking about this for a long time, this is bigger than I thought it was even 2 years ago. The issue of the use of social media and online generally, and how it contributes, and I'm going to use that word carefully, contributes, not the sole cause, contributes to violence. Even the last 4 weeks, my opinion's gone up. It's greater than that I thought it was even last year, and I thought I helped write a review last year about this problem. I think if you look at any serious youth violence that impacts young people between the ages of probably 11 and 25, my absolute that's non-domestic related in the first instance, I would say I can't think of a scenario where there wouldn't be some sort of social media element to that incident. That could be the ultimate catalyst, as in Amrit says something horrible about me and I react to it in the real world, or it could be a contributing factor to what's gone on, be it I've been influenced by, goaded by, or simply I dropped Donna. They're both nodding, so I've said something right. I dropped Donna a DM saying, Matt's peed me off or whatever. I think what we've got to remember now is social media is actually quite a big term. Social media, everyone just thinks it's Facebook, right? Or particularly people of our generation, Matt, no offense. I'm on
MySpace, Paul, don't
Yeah. But the way young people now communicate, like if I said to you, Matt, I'll drop you a text, I've probably sent you a WhatsApp, which is a form of social media. Yeah, so this is just the way young people now communicate, and we are not going to change that. That is just how it is now. 20 years ago, when you got your first Nokia 3210 or whatever, you sent a text message with 164 characters, whatever it was. I can now send you a live stream video. And why wouldn't I do that as a child? Because that's just the way kids now communicate. We have to accept that is the way they now communicate. They use 4 and 5G networks because they don't have credit anymore. We used to have 10 quid a month our parents gave us, whatever. That's gone. You've got unlimited access to anything you want now. So going back to the point though, if I go and do something, be it a crime, I'm involved in a fight, or I'm about to get involved in a fight, I've got issues in the street, or I go and commit a robbery, or I've been robbed, it is going to have a social media footprint in almost every single instance, be it me reporting about it, saying I'm going to get revenge, or the catalyst behind it.
Okay, that's really helpful benchmark. So how big is the problem? Pretty damn big.
Yeah, and I probably again agree with Paul, because I suppose I see it in a kind of a layered approach. I suppose from a policing kind of point of view, we're looking at that kind of proactive, who's involved, who's using social media to maybe goad, revenge, respite. But then you have to look at it broader, I think, in terms of once it's out there in that space, the repeats, how it's forwarded on. And you've got in the space that I have done quite a lot of work, when you're speaking to young people, even if they're not involved themselves in that direct violence, they are seeing it, they're impacted by it. And what kind of footprint does that leave in young children? And without the right kind of guidelines and the right measures in place to protect our young people, you've got children as young as 8, 9, and 10, and I've spoken to children of this age who are seeing this material, this content online. So as stated, for me, it's a very layered approach from a policing point of view, where me and Paul probably sit in terms of the monitoring, the management, the proactivity in and around it. But then you have to look at the wider implications and the impact that young people are exposed to on a day-to-day basis that leads to things like radicalization, that leads to kind of copycatting of types of behaviors. And I think we saw this in particular with Red versus Blue. This was maybe like 4 or 5 months ago, whereby you've got content going out where young people are being goaded, encouraged to take weapons into schools. It doesn't become just a London problem, it becomes a broader national problem. And that is the strength and that is the power of social media, in my humble opinion. So
that's really hard. I don't want to put you on the spot and say like which platforms are the worst here. So let's talk about usage. you know, the types of use for children where they're becoming the perhaps is the most dangerous types of use? Is it just sort of scrolling through feeds, Donna, where you're talking about seeing different types of content which might lead to radicalization? Is it messaging? Is it video? Where are you sort of seeing, and Don and Amrit, you may have a view on this from research perspective, particularly where data is being donated to you. What I'm trying to think about compartmentalizing this big problem, Paul, as you said, social media is a big thing. What are the compartments of that we want to think about dealing with first?
I think I want to very quickly, the question you asked earlier around the proportion of people seeing this sort of content, or I kind of want to highlight that it's not a case of looking at the population in its entirety and say, because it's not experienced evenly. This is very much an inequalities issue. It's disproportionate targeting. So saying a question, and I appreciate the question, but I'll call it out, Max, I didn't like it because we can't say it at a population level. We need to look at it at a subgroup level. What groups of young people are actually seeing this sort of content in the first place, and why? And when we take it backwards, it's a case of, when we think about, for example, I was at a roundtable recently with the Social Media Victims Law Centre that dealt with the recent successful litigation case with Meta. And one of the biggest things that came out from that was the internal documents that were highlighting that these platforms are actively targeting specific children with glorified content to keep them hooked because they understand that they're vulnerable. So it's the internal things that are being done by platforms, it's the behavioural profiling. These are the things that we should be focusing on, not so much how many people are being affected. I appreciate the question there, but it's not how many people are being affected, it's what people are being affected and why. And that's the biggest thing to think about, because risk is inherent in adolescent. They all experiment. But the problem with social media is a one-off accidental click, seeing something doesn't result in one-off incident. It results in more and more and more. And the algorithm then essentially begins to shape the norms of a child and what they believe to be normal changes. And that's all within this echo chamber and this silo. So I think these are the questions we should be trying to focus on. I appreciate trying to sort of understand population prevalence is really useful, but for me, it's taken it a step forward. What groups of children are being affected?
And is there research? I mean, I think that's an absolutely fair challenge, so I welcome it. Has there been research on what groups are disproportionately affected, Amrit?
So what we're trying to, I know the Youth Endowment Fund has done a fair bit of work, but I think one of the biggest issues that we're facing in UK cohorts is that more often than not, so if you think about studies, cohort studies like Understanding Society or the Millennium Cohort Study, for children and families to be involved in these sorts of surveys and data collection methods, more often than not, they need to have a degree of, I guess, comfort to be involved, to have the time to dedicate to giving data and information. And the kids that perhaps you want to get picked up in these sort of surveys, more often than not, don't have the ability or time to contribute due to other pressures, for example, working, parents that have to work, etc. So what we're finding is we're missing out on the data we need on these children. So one of the things, again, I don't mean to keep bringing it back to the hub, but was an explicit focus on these vulnerable kids. How do we link in with youth groups? How do we link in with disadvantaged communities that actually need to be picked up in routine cohort studies? Because one of the biggest failures for policy for me is that just because there's no data sometimes on vulnerable groups, it's almost like an excuse not to act. So for me and from the research end, it's right, well, wait a minute, if we get you the data on these vulnerable groups, you have no choice but to act because it's in black and white and we've documented harm.
How long has the data donation thing is really interesting. How long has that been running and what sort of response are you getting at the moment?
So this is a relatively new method of data collection. So I was previously at Cambridge, we tested the feasibility there. And there's new methods that have been employed that I guess make the whole process a bit more streamlined in terms of, prior to this, you'd have to the child would request their data, they'd have to wait 5 days for it to arrive in their inbox, then they'd have to donate it to research, and that process is obviously time consuming, it's burdensome for kids. So we've got new methods wherein the data can be transferred directly from the platform to the, for example, the university, which will hopefully streamline that method. But one of the things that you're experiencing in this sort of environment is that you're receiving a lot of data at scale, a lot of data. If you imagine everyone's social media history and you've got 3,000 kids, that's a lot of videos, that's a lot of text, that's a lot of comments. So that's where, for example, using things like generative AI combined with humans can be really novel, because it allows you to annotate at scale what kids are seeing online. So don't get me wrong, there's definitely hope. We're working on it, but I think I just keep bringing it back to the siloed working approach. I think it's times like this, we've got these wonderful methods, but not only just with it, we don't just need collaboration when it comes to, for example, the police force, healthcare, academics. We need collaboration within academia, because again, ego is a thing in academia, you're probably all aware. So how do we begin to work better as academics, begin to share resources, begin to share methods, rather than actively competing with each other for the next publication?
Yeah, here. I want to sort of tackle this a little bit more detail. Donna, we talked about the Social Media Partnership Engagement Board. It might be useful to hear a little bit about what that is and what it does. But the question I want to plant for all three of you here is, if there is a public health response that is collaborative in the way that Amrit's talking about, what does that look like? Who's at that table and what sort of work are they doing? But Donna, if you could just fill us in on that engagement board and how that works at the moment, that'd be a good starting point.
So in essence, it's been running for the last 2-3 years, and it's still very much an evolving space, I will add that. But it really is an opportunity to bring key stakeholders, which does include social media companies when we can get them on board, and it does include our social service partners. It's those people that are really invested and involved in the lives of young people in particular, who again are the most vulnerable and susceptible to serious youth gang violence. We meet every quarter, and what I've tried to do over the last couple of years in terms of making it meaningful is to have the right inputs, the right infrastructures in place to ensure that those who attend, they can walk away with an understanding of current themes, trends, what they're seeing in their area of business. Like, say, for example, from a social service perspective, what are they seeing with their clients? From a violence reduction unit perspective, again, understanding what they're seeing with their young people, and just trying to, I suppose it's a networking space to really see how we as partners can really learn to support each other within the space of serious youth gang violence, where social media is overlaid. As stated, it is very much an evolving space. So I'm always looking to bring more people to the table to have those conversations. But what we have been able to do, a bit like Amrit's been speaking about, is to use those opportunities to identify young people in particular who can give us an insight that we don't sometimes acknowledge, and I think is often neglected. We have these deep strategic conversations about social media, the issues and the concerns, but what is often missing in those conversations are those who are the most impacted by serious youth gang violence within that social media space. So the mindset has been, as stated, that we have social media companies involved so they can get an insight from a different perspective that can hopefully inform and shape some of the decisions that they are making. We routinely have Ofcom in the meeting with us as well, just to give us an insight into some of the work that they are doing and how we as a small group of people can inform and support some of the work that they're doing. But yeah, still very much a growing space. But the hope is that we're able to network and share what we are seeing in our individual professional spaces, and how we can then bring that back to, like I say, those who are the most affected by serious youth gang violence and social media.
Or is this something that is replicated around the country? In your experience, every force trying to do this, but doing it in their own way?
Yeah. I mean, I'll be completely honest. I think it's taken quite a long time for people to really understand the importance of engagement in this space. And I'm going to be, I can see Paul nodding there. I think he knows my passion around this. I think from a policing point of view, of course, we're very good operationally, tactically, strategically. But I think what is always somewhat missing are those people that are the most impacted, and having those conversations. And as has been shared before, that collaborative public health type approach. We can't approach this just in isolation in policing. We can't. It won't work. We have to work with our partners. We need to understand all those factors that are impacting, like I say, and I keep stressing on it, those who are the most impacted by serious youth gang violence and social media. So can I say categorically this is happening in other parts of the country? No, but I know that within the Met we have taken a very proactive approach, and it has been a growing piece of work to really understand all elements of social media, and that does come with engagement. Sorry, Paul, over to you.
No, I don't know, Matt, you if I jump in there, or do you want to
Go
clarify?
for it. Go for it.
So I was sort of writing down, I was like bullet pointing, and then I'm on page 2 now, so I'll try and keep it succinct. So Donna used the right phrase there, proactive. So if you're going to try and tackle this stuff, you've got to be proactive in it. Historically, particularly with the online space, and it's not a criticism of law enforcement because we're asked to do an awful lot in society these days. We tend to pick up our online work once the thing has happened, the stabbing, the robbery, the sexual abuse, etc. We come in after the fact, which is actually what most of policing is. We are, responding to things that happen in society. But if you want to get ahead of the game, you do need to be proactive in this space. So I'll sort of give you a hypothesis. These things happen all the time, but hypothetical setting. An individual is on a large main platform and is saying that he wants to go and cause serious harm to a member of a gang in another part of a city. Okay, pretty generic thing I just said there. Happens every day, right? Literally happens every day. Now, a little bit like when we were younger, you're in the playground and you make a comment in the playground, I'm going to go and fight Matt after school, etc. That comment will come and go really, really quickly. Yeah, at school, when if I just said it in a classroom or whatever, it doesn't come and go quickly online though. I post it online because I'm angry because I'm a teenager with hormones and this sort of stuff. And then Amrit comes in and says, "Well, go on then, Paul." And then Matt will come in and says, "Go on." And they can have an opinion whether they've met me or not. And suddenly, my instinct reaction to go and do something, cause harm to someone, has to now become a reality because I've got to go through with what I've just put down in writing. And you see the goading. You can literally see the goading happening in social media posts. Well, go on then. You said you were going to do this. Go on then. Go on then. Whereas 30 years ago, if I'd sit in the playground because I was annoyed because I lost football against whatever it was, by lunchtime we'd forgotten about it. A bit like when Amber said we comment we have for breakfast. Yeah, because it wasn't written down. If it was written down, you go back to your notes and go, "Well, there it is." So that's the first thing. So in terms of who should be at the table, which was your original question, I think the ideal is health. Education, huge, obviously policing, but actually the social media platforms themselves, and then probably some other key stakeholders, probation, etc., prisons as well, that sort of stuff. The issue is how much in the law enforcement piece and all those other sort of stakeholders, we all sit on information that we can and can't share for various reasons. Yeah, Human Rights Act being the biggie. So let's say I'm sat on that information that Paul's going to go and cause really serious harm to person A in county B. Well, I'd like to go and tell insert platform here that that's going on, and that could you please just kind of deal with that? Because from a technical level, they probably have, but actually, I'm then sharing relatively sensitive information about an individual with a platform and potentially getting him banned from a platform for something he hasn't even done yet. So it's getting that balance between the human rights piece, your freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom to live a private life, etc., versus the police saying, well, we don't necessarily agree with that, and we want insert social media company to sort of delete all these posts and that sort of stuff. And do you want to live in that society? Are we comfortable with living in that society? I don't know, because change, it might start that way, and I can only talk for myself. We would never abuse it. I don't think I ever would, but societally, could it? Who knows? So you've got to be really, really careful about balancing that piece, because I know I'm going to put a link in the chat. You might find it interesting. On the continent, particularly sort of the Nordic states, they've had this problem for a long, long time. Violence as a service is a real issue there. And one of the very large tech companies would happily ban any gang member in one of those countries if the police just gave them the list. But again, you've got that whole decision. Who makes that decision that we're going to tell this social media platform, which is a company, to they're not a stakeholder, they're not a sort of professional stakeholder, that we're going to give you this list of people that we want to do something. Are we comfortable with that as a society, doing that and saying these people are really problematic, you should ban them from doing this thing? Really, really difficult. But to go back to your original question, all different companies, lots of different organisations, both public and private sectors, sit on really useful information to help safeguard young people, and we are not joined up. Everything you've got the high-end law enforcement stuff, you've got the schools, and a lot happens in schools, it doesn't filter through. You've got the probation service, but you've also got the outreach teams as well, who's doing some phenomenal work, on the streets with these kids, and they get all this really useful stuff that I'm definitely AMRET would suck up and that sort of thing. But we aren't joined up because it is so big. It is so big.
AMRET, you've just been made the social media czar for the health service and the government. What are you setting up? What does it look like?
I think this will potentially just reiterate what Paul and Don have just said, but we talked on Friday actually about the concept of digital sanitation. And what we deem it to be. So this is a public health approach to creating healthier digital environments by actually independently measuring, monitoring and reducing harmful content exposure. Just as we did for things like when it came to unclean water and food safety and tobacco control, exactly the same principles that we used in previous public health challenges. So if we go back to the 19th century, we had unclean water and we implemented sewerage systems and water sanitation. In the 20th century, we had infectious diseases. What did we do? We implemented vaccines and we implemented surveillance. So it comes back to data. We have pockets of data across different departments that are not being connected. And the biggest sort of issue that I've experienced as a researcher is that if I was studying tobacco, we wouldn't rely on voluntary disclosure from tobacco companies about what they were doing. It would be a mandatory requirement. So why does the same not apply to social media? Why am I, as a researcher, chasing my tail to try and get data on what's happening on social media profiles? Why is Paul and Don, etc., why are they reliant on reports from people instead of actually having an understanding of what the platforms are actually doing? And I think it comes back to that sort of transparency question. And I know that today's focus has been predominantly on what we can do as practitioners, but I want to put those back on governments. What are governments doing above and beyond things like blanket bans? We need platform accountability. Today, Donna, you touched on that you needed to be accountable as a police officer. I completely agree, but we're missing the bigger picture. What are governments doing to be accountable? Rather than implementing blanket restrictions like bans, why don't you tell me how you're actually going to do it? Why don't you tell me if it's going to work before you start playing with people's heartstrings? For example, the parents of bereaved parents whose children have died, for example, for a number of different reasons. So for me, what is a public health approach? It's the ability to measure exposure, it's the ability to measure disease burden, it's the ability to measure marketing practices, industry influence. What are they doing in this space? And to be able to track that over sustained periods of time, so that not only can we understand what harms are actually happening, but we can also understand, is any sort of regulation that's been implemented actually working? The Online Safety Act is calling for the removal of harmful content. If I've got data on what's actually happening on social media, I can actually see, is this content being removed the way it's supposed to be removed? But if that data doesn't exist, no one can be held accountable, whether it be the government or whether it be the platform. So it comes back to the point, it's a data thing. Public health has never relied on industries to regulate themselves. So why are we applying that same mindset here?
Yeah. Do the companies should they be at the table, or should they just be recipients of the directives of that function?
I think that it comes back to an ethics question, I think. If we think about, for example, me as a researcher, so there's, for example, some researchers that actively take money from big tech and then do research on social media. And some of these individuals are sitting at the highest level of policy making and they don't get questioned. So I think we need to have a degree of separation, a healthy degree of separation, and that industry cannot be seen to be, for example, influencing what research is being done. There needs to be independence there. It needs to be independent scientific research. Yes, we need to have an understanding of what's happening within the platforms themselves, but I do think that degree of separation needs to exist. And that just comes back to history of commercial determinants research around practices that were used when it came to the gambling industry, for example, as well as the tobacco industry. We need to follow those same practices and carry them forward. Yes, we should be listening to industry, as in big tech, but I think at this moment in time, it's a case of getting adequate data from them that we can actually use to be able to understand the problem. And by adequate data, I mean data that has not been cherry-picked, data that has not been played with before it's given to, for example, myself as a researcher.
Yeah. Okay. It's a sobering discussion about the scale of this challenge and the extent to which we can actually start to solve it. Paul, Donna, there'll be people out there watching this who are dealing with this problem every day on the policing side of things. What's working best for you at the moment in your experience? I'm not asking for research background necessarily on this. I'm thinking you're dealing with this every day. What are you getting the sense of as having the biggest traction in the grand scheme of things? Obviously, that might be quite small, but what advice would you give to others?
I'll go first if you want, Donna. Two things within policing: it's giving someone the skills, capability, and time. I say obviously not one individual, but a team or something like that. The time to do this, really understand this type of work. Open source work, social media, use of it within crime is really niche. To get good at it, I mean, Amrit spent some time with our teams last week, and it's fair to say they're subject matter experts. I think it's fair to say. And they really know their business, these officers and staff. They really, really know it because they are dedicated to this work. A bit like you have specialists in sexual offences, specialists in homicides. You do, unfortunately, now with the landscape we're in, you do need specialists within policing around social media. So that's definitely facet number one. And unfortunately, across policing, because we've got to deal with everything in the society, it feels like sometimes, finding that resource, time and money to do that is a real challenge. And that's something I've seen across, lots of different forces from a national perspective and have done for a number of years as well. I think everyone understands the value of it and everyone understands the importance of it and everyone wants it. It's just, really kind of explaining. That's something Don and I try and do. We try and explain the value of this in terms of prevention and also helping to solve crime as well. But you can't measure prevention. That's really, really tricky to measure. How do you say this team that we dedicated to looking at how gangs or violent people using social media prevented this thing? You can't do that. You just don't know. So that's issue one. But the second other thing is education. Now, whether that comes from policing or with policing or nothing to do with policing, I don't really mind, to be honest. The education levels out there amongst parents and in schools is actually relatively low in my experience. The understanding of what this stuff does. I do talks in schools where I live of an evening occasionally, and they're appalled at how easy it is to find drugs on the internet. And we've been finding drugs on the internet for 10 years. And this isn't dark web stuff. And it's that kind of raising awareness within society to allow parents and children to, I'm going to use the phrase police themselves, but I don't mean the word police, that makes sense, to understand when I give the child this thing, this piece of plastic, where in the world it can actually go. I call it like digital playground lessons. Would you let your kid into a playground that had lots of baddies with knives, guns, weapons, sexual abuse, which if you knew the playground had that, you wouldn't let your child in the playground. So educate the parents on what is in the playground. That's the important thing, because that's how we get the prevention piece, because it cannot be done by policing. It has to be done. I'm not blaming or putting it on the schools, but someone within that setting.
Sure. What resources are out there at the minute, Paul? Is it piecemeal, or are there is there a national suite of resources for this?
Certainly not within policing. There's not a national suite. No, I did see one of the questions in the chat, which I can actually answer. But no, there's a lot of really good not-for-profits out there, and I'll stick some links to the ones that I know, not necessarily endorsed by, but the ones I know. But you have to go looking for it. I don't know. I've got, I don't know what's taught in schools these days, but I can almost guarantee you there isn't an hour a week of digital learning, digital safety learning. But it feels like there should be, right? We have lessons to safeguard us against all sorts of stuff, but actually in 2026, where every child has a phone by the age of about 12, do we now need to think about our curriculum and what that looks like, and do we need some time in there to say, right, this is the score? And actually, how valuable could that be to someone like Amrit, to understand what's coming back from the schools. You know, what is the feedback in schools? You know, I hear some schools, you know, you go into your assemblies and you raise your hand if you've got access, you know, unfettered access to a tablet, and it's a worrying number of children that have unfettered access to a tablet or something similar from like 8, 9, 10 years old, which does worry me a little bit, to be honest. And are we teaching them are we setting them up for life? Not sure. But to answer your question, there is no kind of one-stop shop. But there are some useful websites, but I'll put those links in when I shut up.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. That's terrific, and we can circulate those out in the notes after. Donna, did you want to come off the back of that, or I have a question for Amrit that will spin off from this?
No, I was just basically going to add a little bit to what Paul has covered off quite nicely. Anyway, he's right. There isn't, in the work that I've done and what I've seen so far, a specific one-stop shop. And I think when you look at not just policing, I think you look at everything within the public sector, everybody's under the cosh in terms of resourcing, demands, what is a priority, what isn't a priority. And I think that comes into the educational space as well. So again, what we try to do, as when we can have the capability and the time to do it, is to go into schools and have those conversations. And as Paul has quite rightly alluded to, you've got young people as young as 9 and 10 who are on social media, on their mobile phones, their laptops, you know, 10, 12, 13, 14 hours. And we're police officers and we're having those discussions with young people about how you can keep yourself safe online. But I think I go back to my original point. This can only be done in collaboration. We've got to do it from a collaborative point of view in order to really empower our young people to better understand what the dangers, but again, what the benefits of social media as well. So yeah, I'm just backing what Paul has already mentioned, that there is no one single stop shop, but there are plenty of websites, there are plenty of agencies out there that are doing their own pieces of training, but how do we bring that all together into one space to ensure that we're capturing all of the information?
Ava, I'm going to ask you to come in a second and just run through what we've got in the Q&A, but just to segue you into that, Amrit, I was just thinking about collaboration. You mentioned earlier universities need to get their acts together, put their egos at the door. What does that look like in terms of something tangible in the next 12 months, 2 years? Are there partnerships already out there, consortiums out there already working towards research in this area, or is there something new that needs to be set up?
I think my ask of the wider public would be to scrutinise what they read before they digest information. And by that, I mean conflicts of interest exist everywhere. We saw it with climate change, the amount of people that had money in oil, etc., that were going against certain decisions that were acted to be for public good. The same applies here. It applies at the academic level, it applies at the WHO level, it applies everywhere. There are conflicts in this space, and I think we need to, as the public, be a bit more critical of what we're seeing before we decide something is bad or good. So I guess that would be my first ask. In terms of the academic, the collaborative working, so like every space as Donna touched on, there's no resource. There is literally no money in the pot to do research. There's no money, like for example, to keep my job, I need to continuously apply for grant funding to allow me to keep working. And that applies to the majority of academics that are out there. So I think the biggest thing for me is, and I said this to Sarah Jones when we were at Minister Sarah Jones at the Anti-Knife Crime Coalition, and I've also said it to a number of other partners, including the violence reduction units. We need to sort of come at this problem as not a sort of one-stop fix. We can't just fix it with one thing. We need to begin to build infrastructure that is going to allow us to respond well as these platforms evolve, because my God, as soon as this ban is implemented, they will be off thinking about other things. They already are actively designing other things that kids can then move to once social media is restricted. So for me, the biggest thing is, how do we begin to think about a sort of an online harms observatory, collecting data from all these different sources, linking it together, as I mentioned earlier. And naturally, by doing that, we're then creating a shared resource that academics can access, that police can feed into and access, that educators can access. I think we need to see this now as more of we need to think strategically about it. We need to think that, yes, it might be about a 50, 60, 600 million pound investment right now, but it's going to serve us well. because AI is not quieting down. AI is only going to get louder. And we are going to be at a real misfortune if we don't begin to think about actually embedding this infrastructure in the lives of all practitioners that experience this. And that would then allow us to generate this one-stop shop. If we've got data on everything, we can then build resources around what that data is telling us. Don't get me wrong, I think it's wonderful that different organisations do it. For example, the Youth Endowment Foundation, some fantastic work. But how can we begin to link this all better together? Because this is a threat that is bigger than governments, and we have not experienced this before. Governments are scared of big tech, and we can see that quite visibly. So not only does this need to happen in the UK, if we could really build this best practice here, I'm already talking to the WHO in Europe, they're already trying to think about how they can build the system. And then we begin to link it better. As I mentioned, it comes back to leaving egos at the door.
Yeah.
Everyone needs to begin to say, right, what can we do that's different to you, and how can we link it?
Thank you. Ava.
Hi, yes, I have a couple questions that have been building up in the QA throughout. The first one is there a national or regional group that coordinates proactive engagement with social media companies rather than each force doing this separately?
There's no national group. It's a really good observation. It's something that's come up at a very senior policing level, at MPCC level, around do we need that? You've obviously got the crime side, you've got the sexual abuse side, you've got the counter-terrorism side, and they all involve work with social media companies, different policies, etc. So right now, no, there's no dedicated sort of police team per se. I'm lucky enough that my role requires me, or albeit I wrote the role description for this piece, to engage with social media platforms around knife crime, knife weapon sales, etc. Because there's new legislation coming specifically for that. But in terms of is there a mailbox and they all escalate it to platforms? No, there isn't. Not saying there shouldn't be, but I don't want to keep blaming resource, but I will blame resource. And also policing priorities, because every member of the public in the UK has got a different perspective on what they think a policing priority is, which is a real challenge. And again, who owns this space, I guess.
Amazing, thank you. Similarly, is there a drive to adopt an industry-funded model for social media? So, do you want more context on this question? This person said, a small one. They said, we have BTP funded by the railway, but the principle is the same, and it's not forced platforms being used to give policing algorithmic transparency.
I think
Amrit,
that's
I know you. Amrit is the one to answer this.
I think that sounds wonderful in principle. It does. We would not be in this position right now if we were able to do that. I think when I started in this field, I was very naive, and I thought, yeah, the government can go and force them to give us the data we need. The police can force them to give us the data we need, but there is little control on the ground. These organisations have a lot of power. We're seeing more and more, if we look across the sea to what's happening in the US, they continue to acquire more power. When we think about the political realm right now in the US. So that's why I keep coming back to it. The point around the fact that the only way that this issue, and we're going to be able to handle this, and by that, by handle, I mean trying to begin to look at the design of these platforms so kids can harness the good but not actually have to see the bad stuff, is for all of us on the ground to partner, because no one is big enough to fight big tech right now to get them to do what we want them to do. And I think that there's been a level of foolishness on the ground around the fact that everyone's tackled this and be like, well, we can do it. You've had the UN try to do it. You've had the WHO try to do it. You've had the UK government try to do it. So I think, if anything, the lessons learned are that we all need these people to be in one room together, actually talking and saying, right, what can we do now? And I keep bringing it back to that point. I know people might get frustrated. We can't just say it's collaborative working, but from my understanding now of being in different rooms with different people trying to have the same fight, nothing is working. So the only option to me now is, and I'm actively trying to do this, but my God, it's hard. How do you get everyone in the same room to be able to begin to think about, right, what's the best way? What's the plan of attack here, based on what we've all independently tried and failed at?
It's great. I don't think that that drum can be banged too many times, Amrit. I think that the situation has been really well described, and it's a really powerful call for action to leave us with on this call. I just want to say before we go, thank you very much to Donna, to Amrit, to Paul for your contributions. We will be bringing the recording out on our members hub, and we welcome follow-up questions to the panel. We will be in touch as well with documents that we have listed in the chat throughout. So you've got a list of resources for this, and really thank you to everybody for coming along today. Much appreciated, and we'll see you next time.